Hello and welcome to Rebuild. My name is Michael Belch, and as always, I'm joined by my brother Bradley Belch. Here at Rebuild, we have a desire to rebuild our society in a way that honors God, in a way that follows biblical principles, and in order to do that, we need to understand what God has said about the various aspects of life and society. And today we're going to be following up from the discussion that we had with Eric Bell, talking about business, and it kind of stayed more in the realm of big business. So I'm kind of reframing that discussion for our own thinking, that we talked about the place of big business in society and how Christians should view that and interact with that. And today we're really excited. We're going to kind of jump into some tangents from that. We have some ideas about what Christians can do, and also some of the difficulties that just face us in the society in which we live when it comes to having wisdom with where we spend our money. Do we stay in businesses? Do we leave businesses? Do we start businesses? Lots of questions like this. So just a friendly reminder, our episodes appear on the major podcast platforms and on YouTube. So you can, if one of those is more convenient than what you're checking out now, or listening to now, our YouTube channel is Rebuild Podcast, and our podcast name is simply Rebuild. And so however you find it more convenient, we really appreciate you listening to that, and we hope that the discussion today will be helpful to you. Okay. We were talking before the show about something that we want to improve on, and specifically that is recommending resources for you all. And so before we forget later on, and if we remember, we'll say it at the end too, but one resource that Bradley and I we've both been listening to it for a while, but there was a particular episode that touched on some of the topics that we want to discuss today, and that is the King's Hall podcast, specifically season 1, episode 24, which just came out last week or the week before that. The title of it is called Wealth, Money, Space, and it talks about this idea of what is the goal for Christians in building wealth? How do we use wealth not simply as a means to secure our retirement or to provide for our families, which are, not bad things, but specifically, how does wealth and building wealth relate to building God's kingdom? And so that's one resource we want to recommend to all of you, and we hope that will be helpful to you as well. So. Okay, Bradley, where we want to start today is kind of this difficult question of Christians in big businesses, and as businesses either display or embrace more and more ungodly ideas from kind of the top down, the corporate vision, the messaging, the branding, the changing the logo to the pride colors, for the month of June, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How Christians should think about, do I stay in a big business like that where I have no hope of changing it? Do we build parallel economies? Do we get out and start our own businesses? And you were saying, Bradley, that the discussion with Eric kind of triggered some, a depth of a perspective that maybe you hadn't considered before. Do you want to talk us through a little bit about your thoughts from the discussion with Eric on that?
Yeah. My disposition right now with everything going on in our culture, going on in society, particularly through COVID, is that we are not in a place as Christians, as a society, where voices of reason and voices of truth should be able to stand up, should be taking a back seat. And in doing so, Christians that work at organizations like Disney, woke organizations, any woke organization like Disney, and pretty much you can name any organization and it's going to be woke to some degree, they should not be in a position where they stand or where they sit and be silent. They should be making truth claims with conviction, and if that costs them their job, that costs them their job. That's my general disposition. And it's easy to say, very hard to do. The conversation with Eric, though, did adjust my thinking on that a little bit. Um, we do need solid Christians in those positions for the long game, and we those Christians need to be thinking about it as a long game, and so picking their battles and winning the small victories with their coworkers as they can. Um, but there might be some prudence and some wisdom in hanging tight, working through some of the difficulties of what it is to be a Christian in a woke environment, in order that down the road, um, there's enough Christians or there's enough cultural winds behind you to really make that stand. So that's kind of it did alter my thinking on that. Just there's probably value in Christians sitting tight. Um, and then as I'm talking, I'm like, well, okay, but at some point they're going to have to take a stand. At some point they're going to have to. So I, like now I've talked myself in a circle, because that's all good and well, except for if you never actually pull the punch, then, or if you never actually throw the punch, then,
Right.
What are those 15, 20 years of hanging tight in that environment? What have they done? You might have had a witness to some coworkers along the way, but as far as changing cultural environment in a corporate business, what have you accomplished if you don't eventually get to the punchline? So I don't know. I just talked myself in a circle on that point.
Well, I think about one of the ways that our country got itself into the situation that it is now, and that was it was telegraphed. The Marxists back in the 40s and 50s, they talked about the long march through the institutions, right? And they said it, and no one believed them at the time. And what happened was they got teachers into positions in universities and presidents of universities and a few politicians here and there and a few businessmen here and there, and that grew because then they would teach other people, and it was kind of like discipleship, and it spread. And so there is a sense where part of where we are now is because people who believed on the other side, went to these positions and played the long game and stayed there, and obviously were vocal about it. I would say also we're here because when that happened, universities and businesses didn't throw those people out. They kind of saw them as anomalies, and pretty soon there were more of the anomalies, and they were the rule. But I hear what you're saying, Bradley. There is a sense where, if you can be in a company for a long time and have an influence there, and even move up the ladder, and have an influence in that way, it's a good thing. Now, what's tricky for Christians is we can't stay in an environment where we're being forced to, or asked to, or told to live in a way that does not honor God. And that's kind of, it's not a disadvantage. It's actually a great advantage. It clarifies things for us. But we would have to step out, whereas maybe someone in a university who was a Marxist, they would just kind of keep their head down and get through. So.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that they may keep their head down and that'd be fine, but they would also be in a position where they could argue their religious Marxist belief and call it, well, I'm just, this isn't a religious belief. This is just, an educated belief, or, whatever they wanted to say. As Christians, as soon as we pull the quote unquote religion card or Bible card, then you're instantly ostracized, in a way that, somebody claiming Marxist beliefs would not be, because that is not viewed as a religious belief, even though it is. And we've talked about that in previous episodes.
Right.
The war we are facing, or we are in, is no longer like left and right. It is religious versus demonic. Like it is there are the left and right debate is not a political debate anymore. It's a religious debate.
Right.
So but the Marxist is still not going to get called out for that in a corporate sense. for their belief being religious, because that's not the way we see the war right now. That's not the way it's being framed, even though it is.
Yeah, so there's we were talking a little bit about Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and I want to just kind of lay it out there because I think it's helpful for us to think about, not only do Christians find themselves in different situations, but they find themselves in different circumstances, different times, right? So you think about Daniel, Meshach, and Abednego, and when they were brought to Babylon as young men, promising young men, presumably there were many other Israelites that were there with them, and I probably young men from other countries around the world at that time that Babylon had captured. And it says that Daniel and his friends resolved that they would not eat the king's food nor drink the king's wine, and they resolved not to defile themselves with those things. For them, they knew that doing that, eating that food, drinking that wine, would be to defile themselves. Now, we don't get an indication there that the other Israelite young men, the other Hebrew young men, had that same practice. In fact, we know they didn't, because it was so unusual that when Daniel and his friends asked, they kind of had to propose that little wager, as it were, to see if they were going to be doing better after a short time than their peers, and they were. We remember that they were. There, they were in captivity. Not only were they in captivity, but they were young men, and they resolved to obey the Lord in their own acts of obedience, and they were willing to suffer the consequences. So it was quite dangerous to them to go and reject the king's food. Okay. Later on, with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and specifically with Daniel, with him being thrown in the lion's den, they were in positions of prominence. Certainly Daniel was. And you get the sense, reading the story of Daniel, that he governed in a way that was obviously coming from a godly perspective, because the people around him, the fellow governors, they did not like him. They did not like what he was doing. This was not happenstance that the lion's den situation happened. They planned it because Daniel was a godly man, and he lived in a godly way, and he did his job in a godly way. So this would be like someone working their way up the company now and being very important, but not compromising their beliefs. And I guess my lesson here is, when we do that, it's very likely, if you achieve, a leadership position in your company, if you are faithful not to compromise how you lead and how you work and how you live, it can rub people the wrong way, and they can plot to overthrow you. And in that case, that position meant nothing to Daniel, right? He gave that up freely. He didn't say, oh, I've got 401k built up, or I've got stock options built up, or profit sharing built up, and so just this time I'm not going to pray. He opened his windows and did it very publicly. Like, the point is, he moved his way up, but his I want to make the case that it wasn't just his personal living. I think it was the way that he did his job also is what made those men angry with him. And so they plotted against him. And in that moment, what you're saying, Bradley, or a few minutes ago, he just freely gave that up, right? Okay, yeah. No big deal. Like, that is not what I'm doing here. I'm here serving God.
Yeah.
But then go ahead.
No, finish your thought.
The last thing that we see, though, from this story is they lived in a time of captivity. And Jeremiah, God sent the prophet Jeremiah specifically to tell the Jews before they were taken into captivity, you are going into captivity because of God's judgment on you. Don't fight it. Don't resist it. In fact, you're going to be there for a while. So marry, work, benefit your neighbors. Okay. And that was the situation that Daniel found himself in. Now, what I want to say is sometimes we think, and maybe we're entering this time in America, it might be the case, but we have thought that it's somehow more virtuous or more godly to live as Babylonians or Israelites captive in Babylon, or as second, third century Christians living in the catacombs, hiding from Caesar, right? And I would argue that in those situations, you can honor God by simply serving your boss, right? By having all the fruit of your labor go to a pagan Roman business or family, but that you are not able to live the Christian life in the fullest sense, where you can devote your time and your energy to the service of God, to producing and building things that will honor God. And this was the problem with the Israelites. You know, the refrain that Moses kept saying was, no, they need to go out, and God was calling them out so that their worship, and the key there is worship means service. Their service, their lives lived out would be to God and not to Pharaoh. Okay, and so when we live in persecution or in captivity, like in Babylon, we can honor God, but we're living in kind of a substandard, suboptimal way as Christians. We're not free to let our wealth building and our business building honor God. And so, of course, when we see Ezra and Nehemiah, as soon as they got the chance, they led people back to Jerusalem. No, we're not going to stay in Babylon. We're going to head back and we're going to rebuild, and we're going to do it with passion and zeal and with a lot of investment, both with time and money. And so that was Daniel then, but I have a hard time thinking if God had ended the captivity while Daniel was still alive, I bet he would have been leading that back to Israel to build the kingdom for God's glory again. So knowing the time that we're in is really the point that I want to drive home there.
No, that's really good, and that gets you to a point where we've talked a lot about it off air, and I don't know if we've directly headed it on air. But that gets to the point of tone and comfort. We just simply, I have a hard time moving past the idea that we live in a time where we can get away with just trying to reason cautiously and carefully and using the right soft, perfect tones in order to convince people, make our way, God's way, is better. And we want to play this game where it's like, well, if I could just use the right tone, if I can just be the right kind of loving, if I can just win them with my personality that resembles, an aspect of Jesus, and you, that might, I don't know, there's something about tone that just really I have a hard time with, because we live in a time where we want to try and say that Jesus didn't get angry, or to say that Jesus was just a gentle giant, and he wasn't. Like Jesus spoke truth, and this truth was offensive. We've said that. I've said that, I think, quite a bit. So there's tone, and then there's comfort. We have to be willing to be uncomfortable. As Christians, as believers, we have the confrontation that we're going to face in doing those things is never going to be comfortable. It's never going to be comfortable putting yourself in a position where you might have to have a meeting with a higher up that could cost you your job. Like, that's not going to be a comfortable period of your life. But as men specifically, we are called to go through periods of discomfort. Speaking of King's Hall, Eric Kahns, who is one of the members of the King's Hall podcast, one of the three of them, he has his podcast, Hard Men, and we've referenced that before as well. His most recent one talks about the value and the importance of, I think he calls it eating the ashes. Basically accepting the hard parts of life, because without them, we don't know who we can truly become. We don't know who what God truly has in store for us. And being okay with just going, you know what? Yeah, life sucks right now. I lost my job, or, but this is God's plan, and I can take comfort in that. It's not comfortable, but I can take comfort in that, God has me here. And I want to get the most out of this comfort. Johnny Swim has a good song about that, by the way.
Interesting.
there's a line in a Johnny Swim song, something about like, if I lose you or if I lose a loved one, like let me live in the sorrow of that for a little bit. Not dwell forever, but I want to feel the pain of that, rather than just like be distracted by the happiness, or try and mask that pain with happiness. But we just need to be just uncomfortable. We need to be willing to be uncomfortable, and we got to get over this tone thing. We just have got to get over this tone thing. And yes, I know that there is value in the long game, but at some point we're gonna have to play take action on that long game. And now might not be the time for that. And I think Eric brought up some good points in that. Now might not be the time for that. There might not be enough cultural winds behind us or people around us to really mount that cause. But it is a time to speak truth, and that's gonna be. Yeah. You're gonna get criticized for tone, and you're gonna be uncomfortable.
Well, and I think one of the difficult things for me is I've always been told in the church that we need to be willing to be uncomfortable, essentially, experience discomfort for the sake of the gospel. But I think one of the things that we are trying to pound home here, Bradley, it seems like almost every episode now, is the gospel issues. The political issues of our time are not political issues anymore. They are light and darkness issues. And so when we say we need to be uncomfortable for the gospel, well, that means we have to speak the truth about the cultural darknesses, right?
Yeah.
That's where the discomfort mostly is going to come. Like, almost nobody will care if you have a little, Jesus loves you bumper sticker or a little thing at your desk, right? That's not it. It's when you have to say to your boss, like, this, like, what are you doing? I can't support, like, I can't, like, there's a convenience store where we get gas, and they're putting out trance stickers and stuff like that. And, it's like, I don't know. Do I need to go talk to them and say, I'm going to buy my gas somewhere else, or at least ask why they're doing that? And that's not even a personal relationship, but I don't want to have that conversation. That's a really awkward conversation.
Yeah. And you also feel like it's not going to make a difference.
Yeah, that's true.
But on that note, you don't know you don't know what you taking that one minor stand can do. Now the problem is you might have an effect, but it requires other people to follow suit. And we don't, we see this in the political realm very specifically, that people are not willing to follow suit. Everyone acknowledged that Trump did something that stirred the system, but how many Republicans are willing to go out there and go, oh, people really resonate with that. I'm going to go, stir the system in my way, where I can, how I can, with my right tone. No one's doing that. Like, we see it, but so few people are willing to follow it. So I do say you don't know what effect you're going to have, but at the same time, we do live in a time where we kind of know that whether you have an effect on people or not, so few people are willing to do anything about it. Daily Wire talks a lot about the fact that they have Hollywood actors talk behind the scenes to them all the time. Hey, we really like what you guys are doing. Like, do this. I can never like anything you guys say. I can never follow any of you guys. And this Daily Wire is not the only one that I've heard mention these kind of things. But keep up the good work. It's like, no, you guys that can't be the case anymore. Yeah. Like, we have numbers. We just have to actually be willing to take stands. And as you see other people take stands, you have to go with them. I mean, it sounds a little suicidal, but it's really not. It's really not. Getting back to business, though, we can maybe pivot to a discussion on what the alternative is, right? So, like, if we're going to have Christians that are making stands and potentially losing their jobs, what is the alternative? And there's some discomfort in that for people as well. And let's talk a little bit about kind of what small business entails, what Christian business entails, what the support of those businesses looks like. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. It's hard to think about what a God honoring multinational corporation would look like, right? That's just so far. I mean, goodness, I have no idea. But I can think about what a God honoring family restaurant in a town would look like, owned by Christians. And so part of the difficulty here is that, and maybe it's just a false perception, but it seems like the big business. I don't know what can be done in that area, right? But I do know that a family can run a family business and maybe use that to provide for themselves, to build wealth, to build the kingdom of God, and to build up their reputation in the city. Now, Bradley, you ran a business. Well, we kind of did for a while, but you ran it much longer than after I left for Taiwan, and firsthand the difficulty of having a business that you start up, and it's tough to make ends meet, much less think about expanding the kingdom influence in your community. So I do appreciate what the King's Hall guys talk about with starting businesses, but one of the ideas that I don't remember now if it was them or if it was a different podcast, but and we talked about this with Eric a little bit too, with if we really believe that we need to be building businesses that honor God, and if it's increasingly becoming the case that we can't participate maybe with the woke businesses as Christians, Christians who have money need to use their money to invest probably in small businesses or even larger businesses. I know there's some venture capital people they're not really Christian, but they're trying to develop conservative business platforms, and they're putting millions and millions of dollars. But the idea that the church, and that not the local church, although we can get there, but Christians in general need to have a view to what would it look like if we actively decided that we want to enable responsible, hardworking people with good skills to start businesses. And if one of the big things that's going to be behind that is capital. And right now we still have capital, right? There are many wealthy Christians who invest in their stock portfolio, or they buy gold or whatever. And, maybe it's time to redirect some of that wealth to starting Christian businesses. And obviously those businesses, the goal is that they return a profit to the investors. We're not wanting to kind of, scam people out of money. We're not talking about ourselves. We're talking in theory here. But kind of rethinking what it means for the Christian community to have a mindset, to have Christian businesses built up. And a lot of people, the big hurdle for them is not the effort or the ability or the know-how, it's the startup. It's the startup money.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, the startup is for sure the hardest, and there's risk involved for sure. Now, here's where I would say the Christian has the advantage. If the Christian church would work as the group that it is not only does the church could potentially provide some sort of startup capital that whoever invests in the small Christian business would see returns on. Okay, so that's one of the things that I have a hard time seeing Christians get past is, okay, well, you're asking me to spend, we talked about raspberries off air beforehand. You're asking me to spend $3 more on raspberries because I'm buying them from you, a Christian business, but that's just not being wise with my money. So I have a hard time seeing Christians look past that. And I would argue that it is being wise with your money because those $3 are being invested into something that is better than the globalized, grocery store raspberries, that are $3 or $4 cheaper. We talked about a little bit of that with 5 or 6 episodes ago
With Kevin.
Yeah. But the church has the inherent advantage in not only potentially seeing some return on it after they provide some capital, but they also have a client base. Like they have an instant client base. And the King's Hall talks about this, that episode that Michael referenced at the beginning here. There's the advantage to the Christians that they can invest the money in, and then they also have an immediate revenue source from within the Christian church. But the Christian church has to be willing to make that commitment to say, you're starting XYZ business. I'm there for you, and I'm going to support it. I will go out to eat at your restaurant and no other restaurant, even if I like other restaurants. Like, you're the restaurant that I'm going to support. And to this note, you mentioned we run a construction business. You know, my client base was largely the church members for a long time, and all the way through. And I'm extremely grateful for that. People were willing to take the chance to support me, support my family and the business, and let me do the work for them. So there are Christians willing to do that, but we as Christians, I don't know, we need to be willing to do that on all phases of life. Is I guess what I'm going for. You know, we have to be willing to say, this is something that it's a mentality shift. Yeah. We are building not just wealth, but we are building kingdom. We are building purposeful things. We are fulfilling the creational mandate in what we are doing. It's not just I'm in it to make money so that I can live comfortably at the end of my life, we are building so that our generation and then the next generation and then the next generation after that can follow in our footsteps and continue to build. I mean, it literally is civilization building. What we have to do is do that within an existing civilization.
And I was going to make that same pivot that you just made there, but before we do, I wanted to mention one thing about your comment about, would people spend more money for a locally sourced raspberry, and specifically like one grown by someone in their church? And I actually think we already all have products that we will spend more for, right? Like unless you are, I guess charitably extremely disciplined with your spending, or unless you're just really kind of a penny pincher in the negative sense of the word, well, you will never spend anything more than the bare minimum. We all have the products. Maybe you like better ice cream, right? If you buy cheap ice cream, it's not as creamy, right? So maybe you like just tastier ice cream, right? We all have products already that we will spend more money for. And why not spend a little bit more money to support a local Christian business?
Yep. And yeah, I mean, now I'm thinking off the cuff. Can a Christian church or a Christian society, or whatever the scale would have to be, can it get to a point where 70-80% of that church is self-sustaining? Now we're getting into the a discussion that we would like to have with Yogi Naresh on parallel economies. Yeah. But that should be what Christians are thinking about. Can we get to a point where our church is 60%, 50% self-sustaining, where everything that people are doing within the church is insulated from inflation, is insulated to a degree from regulation, from government overbearing policies? Like, can we create something where the church is self-sufficient on its own? But again, to really bear down on this point, it's going to take a mentality shift. That has to be something that, as a church collectively, elders need to be thinking this way, and that needs to be a direction of the church. And I think that is in keeping with God's word. I don't think it's too far outside of God's word to internalize the growth of a church's wealth. And I'm not saying the church specifically. I'm saying the members of the church's wealth, building something that affects the community. But that's I don't know. I don't know if we're there as Christians, as a Christian church in America, where churches are willing to make that kind of mental shift.
Yeah. And the mental shift, you mentioned the words a few minutes ago, but it's such an important point that I want to say it again. The mental shift is switching to a mentality of building, right? Switching to a mentality of building. And one of the big things that has been a thought-provoking idea for me in the last year has been the idea that we do not only build God's kingdom by people being saved. Right now, of course, that is a primary and necessary, and if we ever take our eyes off of that, then we're in trouble, right? But God's kingdom exists where people follow him, but also where his law and his rule is established. Now, that's what drove the European, especially coming out of the Reformation, but even before that, in the medieval times, they have issues in the medieval times, but they were developing universities, and forms of government were changing somewhat slowly, but the idea of individual rights versus the right of the king, all of that was developing in the Middle Ages, and kind of bore fruit coming out of the Reformation to this idea that Christians ought to be building. I was just thinking about this the other day. In the creation mandate, which we've mentioned a couple times, be fruitful and multiply and rule the world, and I had said subdue it, and you liked the idea more of having dominion over it. That is echoed by King David. Well, I guess maybe he was. I don't know how old he was when he wrote it. In Psalm 8, where he talks about how great God is, and then he says, "What is man that you are mindful of him, the son of man that you would consider him?" And then it says, "You have made him a little lower than the angels, and yet you have crowned him with glory and honor." And it talks about our position still as rulers. We forget that even under the curse, our role, one of our roles as humans, is to rule the world. And we have to have this mindset change where we are building, not just through evangelism, but through building businesses and families and culture, to go way back. I'm not going to go there. To build culture that honors God. And I think when we as Christians think about money and business, we primarily think, and Bradley, I'm stealing your line here, we primarily think about Dave Ramsey, right? So be frugal, invest well, save, right? And those are good things. But our default mindset when it comes to money is, for lack of a better word, one of frugality. And I think God's expectation for us is much bigger than that. Frugality is not the goal. Frugality is a necessary step or a means, but the goal is building, kingdom building. And so you think about the Puritans who left England and the Netherlands. They gave everything they had. They got, really kind of scammed into a ship, and they couldn't afford a better ship. And the Puritans were known as a very frugal people, but that's not what their core was. Their core was building. It was creating something, right? And the frugality was necessary because, they had to live simply. But they weren't sitting around being misers. They were sitting around being builders. And we, like you said, Bradley, we've got to change our mindset in the church that is not only okay or good, but it's necessary.
Yeah. Yep. And that harkens back to kind of a comfort, what do we do with the wealth that we accumulate? You mentioned accumulate earlier on. It can't just be wealth accumulation for the sake of wealth accumulation, because that makes us comfortable in the end. If we're not a burden on our kids. The frugality is, like you're saying, is so that things are built. If we're not using that money, we grew up in a context where that money was, for the kingdom, right? So you'd be frugal so that you could give money to the kingdom. And that literally for us meant literally giving money to a family in need, in Venezuela, or meeting the, replacing a washing machine for somebody who didn't have a washing machine, or literally buying groceries. I mean, like literal, like meeting the needs of people. And there's nothing wrong with that. But what we're talking about is taking that to the whole to the whole next level of, not just like, what can I do to make people's life a little bit more convenient so that maybe I can have a gospel conversation? That is a good thing. But what can I do to make a culture that thrives so that the gospel conversation can't help but like come out of everything that people are in contact with? And that's kind of what I think we're driving at, is how do we make everything contagious to the gospel? Because it's just that obvious. The reason the business is doing well is God has blessed it, because we are doing it for his kingdom, building it for his kingdom. So that's what I have to say about that.
Yeah, I just want to encourage you listeners, this might be somewhat of a new idea for you, but you might have kind of a passion or a desire that you've never really thought, I should use that, right? Like, maybe God wants you to develop something or start a business. It's funny, we have a men's chat group here at our church, and several times now people have said, anyone know of a good, reliable mechanic in the area? And the answers have usually come back, no, not really. It's like, well, someone in our church who's mechanically inclined needs to provide an excellent, trustworthy mechanics service to our town for the glory of God, where people know they're not going to get ripped off and their work is going to be done really well. I would invest. I don't have a lot of money. I'd invest a little bit of money to help someone in our church start that business. That's going to be a gospel witness through the excellence and establishing a reputation that you will not be ripped off here. But it's also going to provide jobs. It's going to provide for the person's family who starts it, if it's successful. It just ripples out, right? And then the gospel infuses it both into the quality and in the messaging and then the testimony to the employees. And like you say, Bradley, the gospel must be part of it. Of course, it must be part of it. But that doesn't mean that building the kingdom is only speaking the gospel to people.
Yeah. Well, now you got me confessing, because there was a local mechanic back in Spokane that I did not always support that went to our church because I felt like his prices were too high. Mm-hmm. I knew that I could get an honest evaluation and an honest repair from that particular company. But I did have a mind frame where I thought his prices were too high, so I was going to find a cheaper alternative. So you had to bring up the mechanic thought and get me all convicted here.
I'm sure he wouldn't mind if you just sent him a check.
Yeah, exactly. Here's your reparations.
Oh my word.
But yeah, but again, that speaks to the mind shift, the mindset change that I've had in that, we need to be building for something, as a church, as a nation, as communities around a nation. We need to be building towards something bigger than ourselves. Yeah. And that's going to involve even getting a little uncomfortable with some of our norms, and figuring out, all right, I don't absolutely need 3 different TV subscription, streaming subscriptions. I can cut back on some of these things, so in order that I can spend a little bit more money on X, Y, and Z, or whatever it is, whatever that looks like. But I don't have a whole lot to add.
No, I don't either.
This conversation anymore.
This kind of strayed a little bit from big business, but part of that is that I don't know nearly as much about big business, and so I guess to kind of sum up our thoughts. It's good. It's maybe good for Christians to be in big business for the long haul, to be a witness there, and not a passive witness, a strategic. Like you have to go to the mat over everything maybe, but strategically speaking up, but then realizing that like Daniel, the business, the kingdom, the position is not it. Your service to God is it. And so when it comes to a disagreement, that costs you your job, you joyfully accept that. Just like the people in the Christians, as testified to in Hebrews, they joyfully accepted the plundering of their goods, right? Because your goal is the kingdom, your goal is truth. And so if you're in business and you can have that as your goal, then more power to you, right? More power to you. Secondly, we talked about just the need to have the church reconsider what it would look like to really support a culture of building and creating business, right? So encouraging young men to do it, maybe having an investing pool of some sort, and then encouraging members in the church to use those goods and services. And then last, this huge, colossal mind shift of the church does need to be about building. It needs to be about building. And the kingdom of God is not just accomplished through speaking, but through Christians living out and building out. And the last thing I wanted to say, I'm glad I remembered this right now. One of the reasons why this is necessary, a theological foundation for this, is that Christians are called to be free. They're not called to be free. They're made free. And they're called to exercise their freedom to the glory of God. Before we were Christians, we could not make a business that was glorifying to God. We could not make a product that was glorifying to God, right? But the highest worship that we can give God now is to use the freedoms that we have in Christ to be responsible with them and God honoring with them. And that's why Christians need to push for free societies. That's why the church needs to think about building, because if not, we're just spinning our wheels, serving other people, having our money enrich other people. But it's good and godly for Christians to exercise their freedom in God-honoring ways, and for Christians to push for a society where they have those freedoms. Yeah. So, any last word from you, Bradley?
No, I can't stress enough that two things: that the episode of the King's Hall about wealth and space, wealth and space,
it was called
whatever it was.
Wealth, Money, and Space.
Yep, can't stress that one enough. If you've made it this far, which may not be the case, but if you've made it this far, then you're obviously interested enough. Go listen to that episode. And two, we got to get past tone and comfort. Mm-hmm. We have to get past tone and comfort. It's gonna take Christians being a little bit belligerent. Not in the I say belligerent in the just kind of obnoxious, in your face kind of a way. Not unchristlike, never angrily, never in spite, or never specifically to enrage, but just nope, this is truth, and I'm not going to move off of this. And that is that kind of belligerence. We're just no, that's a dumb argument. Don't, I'm not even going to entertain that argument because it's just dumb. Yeah. And no, this is the truth that I'm going to stick to. Belligerent in that kind of way. So tone and comfort. We got to move off those.
Good. Okay, well, thanks again, everyone, for checking out this episode. And thanks, Bradley, for the conversation. Enjoyed it very much. If you are interested in what we've been talking about, we would welcome you to reply, or to even be willing to come on and discuss where we're wrong, as long as you're coming on in good faith. If you're enjoying it, we are asking that you would, send it to a friend, the episode to a friend, or someone that you think would actually benefit from it. So we appreciate you guys for listening, and we will catch you all next time.
Talk to you guys later.
Bye.